All right. Thank you for being here. Douglas Weissman, writer, traveler, storyteller. There's other things, I'm sure. With a painter, the viewer often tells an artist by their style from their hands have been on it. How are your fingerprints seen in your writing?
Definitely through my obsessions. And so no matter what book or story you are reading of mine, there are certain things that I touch on that thread the needle of my style or my thought process, my perspective. And a lot of it has to do with kind of intergenerational trauma. A lot of it has to do with the way that people treat each other, the morally gray area of doing the wrong thing for the right reason. And that is all over those. Not to mention a love of run-on sentences. I'm sure as we talk more, you'll hear it in the way I speak, and I generally write it that way half the time. The editors love me facetiously.
What advice I got from a creative writing teacher one time was that punctuation is good. You want it, to be correct, but the overwhelming always is, does it make sense?
Yep.
So if a sentence is long, I'm okay with it as long as it makes sense.
That is such good advice, 100%. One of the best pieces of advice I got from a writing teacher on the same note was not every page needs a guitar solo. And it was just this idea that I would do that kind of thing. The sentence would make sense, but it would be, one sentence going on for the length of half a page. And he's like, you know what? It flows fine. It gives you that energy, that kind of frenetic and franticness you're looking for. But if you do it on every page, it loses its sense of urgency, and that feeling then becomes static, right? If you crank it up to 11, if everything's cranked up to 11, nothing is at 11.
Why don't you just make the 11 a 10?
Exactly. I mean, that's basically what it is. So dial it
Are you
back.
are you familiar with the Spinal Tap movie? Is that what
Oh,
you were
exactly.
referencing?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
good. Okay.
I just
So
took it to like how can I apply that in my life as opposed to just laughing? Because they are making a second one, and I'm very excited to see it.
oh, well, right on time, I guess. Right on time.
It's
With
also
the
gonna be, smaller, and so they have to figure out how to make it look big.
nice. Are they for your sentences when they're the longer sentence? Is it mainly an exposition or is it in dialogue? Like, do your characters talk like that, or is it the narrator, or is it just the scene that is getting the solo?
It's usually the narrator, but there are moments when it could be the setting, mainly taken from this is gonna be very specific, but it's, Charles Dickens' specific narrative. Oh, man. I was gonna say it's very specific, but now I can't remember the name now that I am put on the spot, but it's like Brick House or House of Fog, I think. House of Fog. But the point is that in the opening is a few pages long and very Dickensian in that sense that he has to give you the scene of London and how dreary and foggy it is. And so he's describing the scene in a way that takes on the emotions that the characters will then take on. So he's setting the ambiance, but in a way that makes the setting a character. And I thought it was so beautiful and tangible. Like all of a sudden, the space becomes tangible because I'm not just seeing it. I felt it, I tasted it, I smelled it. And that's the route I usually take. It's kind of a mix of that plus the downward spiral of anxiety, where those who have anxiety or have experienced getting stuck in your head and just the thought process where one thought leads to another, and it can feel cyclical too, where all of a sudden that thought takes you back to the original thought, but now with an extra layer of dread. And so I'll take that and I'll spin that out. So it's not so much exposition as opposed to emotionality, I'll call it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I like the tone and pitch of things. It matters. And I say it a lot, but in Moby Dick, I found that there's much more lyricism in it than you would appreciate if you're just reading it and then trying to understand all the words. Because when I read it the first time, I would read a chapter and then write down all the words I didn't know, look them up, maybe look them up right when I, get to the word, stop, look it up, and then keep going. So it really it makes a page and a half chapter take you 30 minutes, but you go through it all, you're looking up the references and everything, and you get lost in those. But then you go back after you know all the words and then read it again. And it's not through the whole book, but there are parts of it that I can definitely point to that you go, oh, this is put together like this on purpose. This is premeditated right here.
Oh, yeah.
When they say that a writer knows every word that they put in whatever they write, I can appreciate that more because not only just rereading and proofreading and reading over and over 20, 30 times something, but also looking for those words that fit together just right to get that mood across is important, that other layer of writing. So it's interesting that it would be the senses, because that is something that hits you all at once, but you're trying to, you can't separate sentences. If you're walking down the street and you're smelling something, it's cold, it's raining, you want to put all those things in there, then yeah, I can see how a sentence gets longer.
Yeah. I mean, that's especially with how you said the sound plus the ambiance of things, the feeling of it. And I'm notorious for wanting to put a word in because I like the sound more than the specific meaning. Where if the meaning's close enough to the word I want, but the sound is better, I'm going to choose that word, even if there's a word that better hits the meaning that I should have for that sentence or for the word placement. But I think that sound is hugely important because for me, I I find it odd that this isn't everybody, but I know it's not everybody. I read in my head while I'm reading the page, right? So I have a voice in my head saying the words as I read along. So sound is hugely important to me. And then all of these references about ancient stories having to be oral. So the sound was important because you'll remember it how you remember. And that's the way stories were shared. So I always read my stories out loud as well as I'm moving through. Like, does this sound the way I want to sound? And whenever I get to those moments where I want that tangible, frenetic piece, is it hitting based upon how it's sounding? So it's not just take out all the punctuation because it still needs punctuation. It still needs a comma or maybe a semicolon or whatever works. I love the M dash just because of that hard pause. Makes
Mm.
me, again, when used correctly, I think it really hits that brick wall that it can support. But it's just that idea of, if I say this out loud, am I getting the emotion that I want? And then am I putting in the correct focus on those sensory details that I need? And Bleak House, by the way, that was the name of the book
Mm. Okay.
for Charles Dickens. It was Bleak House. But in that same sense, smell is the sense most connected to memory. And then sound is something that most people can connect to, like an immediate sense of feeling, right? So if I do a crash or a crunch, people are going to, oh no, what is that? Versus like a sigh, then they can have a sense of relief versus trying to explain every detail of a room. Does that make sense? Where if I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
explain how the bookshelf in my office looks and I'm trying to give you a visual detail, everyone's going to think of it differently. And I will have to do painstaking minutia if I want somebody to picture it the same way I'm picturing it, where that doesn't matter to me. I want you to understand that I'm in a room, there's a bookshelf, but what matters most are the details I'm giving you, which means somebody's size in the background. That detail is important. So I'm going to give you that sensory connection.
Yeah, it's nice. It makes me look more into writers' punctuation and think, what are they using it for? Because there's the reason or the rule of punctuation, and then there's the personal style of somebody that puts in something and uses it, and you can start to see the pattern of it. And you go, oh, they use this when this happens. Like Hemingway a lot puts in a colon when he takes a lot of things out. So you get to a colon in Hemingway, My understanding of it is, the way I view it is, this scene is happening and then there's a colon. It's not getting ready for a list. It's, you've missed the whole thing that got taken out right there. And then it continues on. And you can look at it from one way and just say, nevertheless, we go on. But it is interesting to think, oh, it's why sometimes his scenes jump. And that's it. That's why. But he's letting you know that it's jumping right here for whatever reason, whether he didn't want to tell you or it was edited out or whatever the reason is. So every now and then I'll throw a colon in a scene just to nod to Hemingway.
Yeah. But it comes back to that idea of clarity that your teacher told you, right? You're jumping, but he lets you know you're jumping, and you generally can fill in the dots. There's a thing in I'm going to sound like a nerd, but I am a nerd, so I don't mind. But I think it's called closure in comic book theory. So as comic books, where you can connect the dots between panels, right? They don't explain every little detail that's happening through dialogue or even through the art. But you can still know that if you're in this panel and you move to this panel and they're not in the same position, it's like, all right, yeah, they moved. They're no longer standing in the hallway. Now they're outside. It makes sense. It's in context. I can connect these dots without them having to give me every single detail of them strolling through the hallway, down the stairs, through the front door, and now they're in the street. And that's what I think Hemingway did magically with the colon, or even one of the best examples. And I have to reference this in saying that it's attributed to Hemingway. No one actually knows if he did this or not, but the Apocrypha is now, it is his story. And that's the 6-word story that he was said to have come up with on a bet in a bar. And it just says baby shoes, colon, baby shoes, colon, never worn. Baby shoes for sale, colon, never worn. Right. And so, like what that colon does a lot of work, because he's not saying baby did this and this is what happened. Now I have to give this to you, or now I want to give them up and we're sad, blah, blah, blah. You get all of that in the space between.
Yeah. Also a Dave Matthews song.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is a really good song too. Yeah.
It's all right. Let's not go crazy.
I didn't say it's its best.
Yeah. Okay. It's all right. Let's see. How does screenwriting fit in to your writing then? How much screenwriting do you do versus fiction? And do you see that affecting it? Like, my view of screenwriting was it's much more stripped down, and not that I'm super detailed oriented in regular writing, but I really enjoyed the idea of exterior night grocery store can tell you a whole bunch of stuff versus you're writing it out in a novel.
I think it's a surprise to most people, or at least most writers who work in one medium or the other, that they are completely opposite of each other. Even though they're both writing, they're so completely different. Where doing the script writing gives me an incredible ear for dialogue, which I can then transfer over to my novels. But then doing the novel writing gives me an incredible appreciation and understanding of character, which I can transfer over to the screen. But they are so different in what I am allowed to put on the page, or what I'm supposed to put on the page. Where, as you said, exterior night grocery store, like that's all people are getting. That's the ambiance. In my opinion, screenwriting is far more collaborative and far more trusting, because I'm putting my story on the page, or the story I believe it should be, but then I'm giving it over to somebody else, and then their interpretation of it can be completely different from what I thought I was putting on the page. And it's in that collaboration that we're supposed to come to an understanding of what the story is. But as the writer, if I'm not able to convey what it is on the page and somebody's getting something completely different, I think I failed in my job, right? Because I didn't convey it on the page in the way that I needed to. But then in screenwriting, or in writing novels and fiction, I'm more comfortable there, only because, in case you haven't noticed, I'm incredibly long-winded and verbose. So I translate that easily to writing a book, because I can just write everything and then edit it out later. And similar, I can do that with a screenplay. It's just the formatting makes it far more difficult to do that. Where in a novel, I could just vomit 600 pages and pare it back to 300.
I wonder, how do you see the difference between extremely detailed in writing a novel versus like an overflow of information? The example being like Thomas Wolfe. I don't see his, and then you have his work that's edited and then the unedited stuff, which is a lot more, but I don't see it as a lot more detail. I just see it as a lot more information. So it's not, you walk into the room, on the first wall there's this, on the second wall there's this. It's just, this is this person, they did this growing up, and it just goes into a whole nother thing. You're like, wow, that's a lot of information I don't need versus a lot of detail I don't need.
Yeah, I mean, I love how you differentiate detail versus information, because I think they are both needed, and yet at the same time, in too much, are a flood that overwhelms people. And Thomas Wolfe is a perfect example. The legend says that he was editing his manuscript up until it was going to print. Like, he was making notes in the margin as they were supposed to be sending it to the publisher for print. And so I love that. There was a movie with Jude Law and Colin Firth that came out years ago called Genius, where Jude Law is supposed to be Thomas Wolfe, and Colin Firth is his editor, Max. I forget his last name, but same editor for Hemingway, same editor for F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it's really about that, like how much information Thomas Wolfe kept trying to put in, and how much the editor had to pare him back. And there's this great scene where Colin Firth is talking to Jude Law, and Jude Law is trying to explain, this is great information. We need this. Like, this is when he falls in love with the girl. And Colin Firth is like, he falls in love with her so much that he suddenly becomes a marine biologist. Like, we don't need all of this information in order to know that he fell in love with her, right? Just pare it back. We'll get the message. And you can see it a lot in Tolkien, right? Where we get like 20 pages describing a tree. That's a lot of information. Why do we need that information? Or why do we need the whole family saga of one character when the family has nothing to do with where the character is now? It's just what at the time he felt he needed to put in. And granted, I did hear once that he was paid by the word, which would explain a lot, but I don't know if that's true or not. But I'm throwing it out there. It sounds true, even though I don't know. But it's the detail. For me, it's an understanding of the details you put in matter, because it's an expression of the world. It's an expression of the ambiance and the tone you're trying to set. And what you put in, the reader is going to try and pay attention to. So if you put in too many details, you're going to overwhelm the reader. And it's the same feeling for me with information. The information you put in, the reader is going to pay attention to, thinking it's important. So if you put in too much, it's going to overwhelm the reader. So you don't need the family history for one character if that character is only for, one page, right? He comes in, he says a line, and he leaves. Why do we need to go into the 12 generations of messengers that this one character is coming from? No, he comes in, he says a line, he leaves. Leave it there. It's fine. That's all we need.
Yeah, I feel like Thomas Wolfe would have been good with the audiobook director's cut version, where you have the edited version and then he's just talking about it. Like, he'll stop the reading and, this is because of blah, 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 blah. And he goes on for a whole chapter worth of stuff. And you go, that I didn't need to know all this. Yeah. And if I'm reading it on an ebook, it's going to take forever, because it's going to be hundreds of thousands of pages for You Can't Go Home Again or whatever. And it's interesting seeing I haven't heard of that movie, so I'll have to check that out. But the going to Thomas Wolfe's house, or one of the places he lived growing up, I think it burned down since then. And just seeing, since he was so tall, he used to supposedly stand there and write on top of a ice box. I think that's what we would call it back then, but a refrigerator is what we call it now. And his handwriting was so big, and he hand wrote everything. And you're like, wow, that's why it's so many pages. But then you multiply that with all the information he's giving you, and it's big words on pages and a whole lot of pages. So being the editor for that must have been something.
Yeah. I mean, to imagine what it was, versus what it became.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my mind frazzles just thinking about it.
What came first for your writing? Was it novel writing or screenwriting?
It was novel writing, absolutely. What got me into screenwriting, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I used to say that I'm the only one in Los Angeles who doesn't want to write a screenplay, and then suddenly started writing screenplays, so I could no longer
Yeah.
use that. But what happened was my brother-in-law used to work in the film industry, and we were going for my cousin's birthday. I have a very close family, so we were going for my cousin's birthday to a small play called Pulp Shakespeare. So somebody had taken Pulp Fiction and then rewrote it as if Shakespeare had done it. So iambic pentameter, putting it back in uh, old time England, and it was honestly so much fun. But during a conversation, my brother-in-law had said something about Indiana Jones 4 and how so many directors had said they would direct it. So kind of how did it end up the way that it ended up? And I thought that he said Quentin Tarantino was one of the people who said he would direct it, and my mind just started racing with like, "Oh, what would that have been like if Tarantino
Wow.
directed the Indiana Jones movie?" So that night after the whole affair, I went home and I wrote how Tarantino movies and Indiana Jones movies, a lot of them have cold openings. So I wrote kind of the cold open of if Tarantino had written and directed Indiana Jones, and I sent it to my brother-in-law, and he loved it. And we're like, we should just try to make it. Like just that 5-minute cold opening we should try to do. And it also gave us this idea of what if we did other kind of weird mashups. So it was like, oh, what if Scorsese had directed Back to the Future? And so we did like a cold opening of kind of Biff's Casino as though it was Casino, the movie. And we just
Oh,
kept
okay.
doing that. And we just kept writing, and it got me into writing screenplays. And then I started spinning out and writing full length features. And with him, I also did a lot of other screenplays that were like private company types of things, so I could understand and get better at the process and the formatting and kind of the whole camaraderie of it. And again, that you have to. It really is a community based thing when you're filming, as opposed to just a secluded writer writing one thing and it being theirs. And it was exciting, but again, it was so different. It was a large learning curve on what I can or should include. And he would kind of wrap me on the wrists a bunch of times, be like, no, no, this is the director's decision. You do not put that in the screenplay. You do not write that. Okay, I get it.
Yeah, I first looked at screenwriting as it's giving directions. It's like you're writing a direction manual. And then I was like, it's not really directions because that's what somebody else does with it. It's more of a suggestion manual. So it's
Yeah.
a general vision with suggestions. And you say this type of music or this song or a song like it.
Yeah.
That way
I got to use
everybody
that.
else has their own input. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it made me realize that the actor matters much more than I thought, because what's their take on whatever these words are? It could be completely like in The Usual Suspects when they're reading the line and they're doing the lineup, and each person has to read the same line, but they all have a different take. And that's, I think, a good example of how different you could write something and then an actor could read it and say, no, 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 that's this. So then you get their experience and everything put in there. That leads me to the idea of what makes a B movie feel like a B movie versus a not B movie. Like, how do you look at something and go, that's just bad acting versus bad writing? What's your view on that in scripts?
Oh, I mean, that's having to delineate that is definitely hard, but especially when with B movies, so often even just the way that the camera moves or the camera's positioned or the effects just feed into the feeling of a B movie, right? But coupled with like if it's a B movie setup where the camera's positioned a certain way and it might feel that way, like, oh, there's a B movie, but the acting's great and or the script is great, you can forget about the way the camera's positioned generally, as long as it's not off-putting. As long as it's not like a porthole scene for 2 hours, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but I think that even if the dialogue's bad, if the script is bad, and I say script just meaning dialogue specifically, not so much plot arc, Because if the plot arc's fine, but the script is bad, I think a good actor can sell it. If the plot's bad, or the plot arc specifically, right? If there's no arc, if there's missing connections, if there's no breadcrumbs leading to the end, if there's no catharsis or these things that make you leave a movie feeling fulfilled, that's a whole script issue. And no matter how good the actor is, they're not going to be able to fill that hole or those holes. And that's why having them both is important. But if the script is good and the actor is not good, then you're going to have either a bad movie or a forgettable movie. Where I think, example, I love George Clooney. I think he's a phenomenal actor, but he's always George Clooney. In every movie you see George Clooney, he's the same, but he does a really good job at picking movies in which he fits those roles as himself.
Hmm.
So he's a great actor because George Clooney's not sitting there trying to be Jason Statham or something, right? And that's so that's a good actor also being good at picking and choosing where they do well.
That's a good example. It's kind of like Ben Affleck too, and interesting that they both played Batman.
Yeah.
I wonder how that happened. But then you look at like Michael Keaton, and you go, "Oh, Beetlejuice,
Yeah,
the other guys, and then Batman," and you just go, "Wow, those are three different." He's definitely playing a character. Or the guy that played Lincoln and was in There'll Be Blood,
Daniel Day-Lewis.
and you're like, I didn't even know that was the same guy. Wow,
yeah, he can
that's
sing.
pretty great.
I mean, he's notorious for sinking into characters.
Yeah, it's What is a B movie camera setup then? How do you tell the difference?
Yeah, I mean, I
how-
don't have the technical language, but just in kind of the average layman's terms, it's really just if you look at, let's say, blockbuster movies, they generally have the ability to do higher priced perspective, right? You got the crane camera angle following along on a car as they're driving down Pacific Coast Highway or something. And granted, now with drones, you can get these shots for far cheaper than you used to be able to. So I can't necessarily speak to whether B movies now are having the same camera issues, but they're also, let's say, and again, this doesn't necessarily apply to TV now, but TV 10 years ago, not HBO, you could generally see the difference between the quality or perspective of the way they were putting the cameras versus movies, right? So if you walked into a room and somebody's watching something on TV, based upon the camera angles, based upon the way people are positioned, based upon the sound, you could kind of look at it and say, all right, I know this is a TV. This is a TV series, or I know that this is a film, right? And B movies generally for a long time had more of that kind of TV setup, right? It felt smaller. If you could kind of feel the budget in the filming, but then also in the way that they would try and position things, it was kind of like that feeling of, you ever, it's like that feeling of if somebody made your favorite dish, but it wasn't the person who usually makes it. So there's just something missing, right? It's like if you love your mom's lasagna, but then your sister tried to make it and you're like, well, like it's fine, but there's just, you didn't get the measurements right, or you forgot this one type of cheese. So it's just something off, and you can feel it or you can taste it. And that's kind of the difference. And that's why I think it's so hard for me to explain the difference between the B movie versus blockbuster or kind of impactful movie, is because I don't have the technical language to just sit there and be like, oh, it's they're not using the right camera, or the lens is totally off because the lighting's this or the lighting, and they have a smaller crew, so they're not able to test this or that. And all those things do matter, but I don't know if it's one of those things specifically that I'm not able to speak to.
Yeah, it's a good explanation. It's kind of like how come I can't make a Frosty at home?
Yeah.
You just can't. You gotta go to Wendy's for that. So yeah, maybe it's that certain artistic je ne sais quoi.
I mean, there's something to it. I'm sure if I called up somebody in the industry, they would give me a 5-word explanation and be like, yes, that's what I needed to say. But I'm just the writer, so I don't have that technical detail.
Yeah, I think you did it well. I think it's the perspective too. So it needs to feel different,
Yeah.
feeling different, and then being different and better versus different just for the sake of being different.
Yeah.
You're not going to like shoot from the ground and look at people's shoes and their faces. That's different, but that's not going to give you that Hollywood feel.
Yeah.
So then it's like the Star Trek movies. You see the TV show and you go, oh, okay. And then you see the movie and you go, okay, does it feel different? Or is it because back then I'm watching it in a movie theater versus watching it on TV?
Mhm.
That's probably has something to do with it. But it does, like when you see Picard and then you see him in the movie, even if you're looking at the movie at home, I think you could argue, I would hear arguments for both sides of it looks just like it does for the TV show and it looks different. I
Yeah.
could I could be swayed either way. It'd be a good debate for a high school debate team.
It'd be good. Well, yeah, especially if you put a high school debate team up on there and you just showed them one episode or two episodes, let's say, because they were what, an hour. So you show them two episodes versus one of the movies with commercials, right? It's like, all right,
Yeah.
which one's a movie? Can you tell which one's a movie? Can you tell which one's a TV show?
Yeah. That's interesting. That'd be a good college, elective talking about the differences between TV shows and movies and how you can tell the difference. Like the film appreciation class I took in college as an elective, I thought this is going to be not worth the time, but it was a pretty great class, pretty memorable. Learned a lot
And
of
you
things
learn
about
to
it.
appreciate film through that class.
I did. I did learn to appreciate
Yeah.
film. So,
Nice job.
yeah, score one for the education system, but that was 30 years ago. So I'm not sure what has happened with it now, but maybe you just go, maybe that's the better degree instead of a useless degree. And we could argue over what a useless degree is, but maybe a better degree would be just an elective degree. What did
Yeah,
you what was your major? Electives.
yeah.
Oh,
Because
okay.
I elected to take all of the
Yeah.
things that I took.
All these. So you took karate, yes. Took right. Film appreciation, yes. Pottery, of course I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
And then what
know a
did you
lot
do?
of
So I
stuff.
filmed myself making potteries that then I just kicked.
Nice.
That was my thesis.
And a podcasting one, yes, I did a podcasting one too. It would, I think there's an argument for that, and colleges should look into it because I think that person's more useful than a person with some weird degree that they're not going to be able to get a job in.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus, I think all of these things teach you to think differently. And that's what the focus on one specific thing at one specific time I feel loses. I was having this conversation with somebody on Saturday that when they had a good friend who graduated from college with sound design, but at that time they graduated on an analog experience while everything in the film industry was transitioning to digital. So here they spent all this time, all these hours learning the system that's obsolete, and they either have to retrain on the digital or find a completely new career. So it's kind of like what's the point of this? What's the point of doing all that time?
Yeah. Deep thoughts.
Yeah. So it teaches you to
So,
think. Those are the best focuses, I think.
what would you say writing the most or the biggest things that writing has taught you then?
To read.
Hmm.
That's and
Why
that's
is that? Can you expand on why
yeah.
reading is important for a writer? Because I hear
Well,
it a lot.
yeah, well, as a writer and just as a person, but as a writer, the biggest thing about learning to read is understanding the things that work and why they work, not just that they work. Because understanding why they work means I can now implement that in my own work as opposed to imitating the exact thing that somebody else did. Right. And sometimes you read things and you have no idea. I love it, but why do I love it? And I have no idea why this is working for me because it's so outside of my normal perspective or so outside of what I assumed would work. And, a lot of times, like Star Wars, even though it's not specifically a book, just as an example, Star Wars is completely outside the original, let's say the original movie, not even the original three, but the original movie is so much outside the perspective of what you expect to work, especially at that time. Because what does it do? It opens up in the first minute with all exposition. There's no action. There's no character. There's no person on screen. It's just rolling text in space telling you about the history that happened before you arrived. And so back to that conversation of why do I need to know all this information of people who aren't here? Like, what's the information gap here that I need to know or should know? And here we have Star Wars. That, like, would it be different if it just opened up on Luke standing there looking forlorn in the desert? I don't know, but that's not how it opened up. And yet, Star Wars, we all know the cultural and historical impact it has had on film and on people and on storytelling. And if you learn to figure out why it worked and how they implemented it correctly, as opposed to all the films or all the books that work too hard to provide exposition that's unnecessary, then you can then figure out how or why you want to put it into your story. And a lot of things I've had there where I've read something and I'm like, oh, this is how I can put this thing into my book. And I love it and I want to do it. And then I'll reread it and I'm like, all right, well, it works, but it's not necessary. But I at least was able to figure that out through the process, as opposed to just being in love with an idea and being so gung ho about it just because I loved it that I had to put it in there and then things fall apart. So it also gives you that sense of understanding that you're less precious about things because you are more willing to see what works, what doesn't work, why it works, how it works. And if it doesn't, get it out.
All right. You sold me on the idea of reading then.
That's all right. I mean, you could probably argue against it if you wanted them.
I think one of the big things for reading is so you know the language better. So you have more available. You have a larger vocabulary available, and you don't make grammatical errors that are going to derail a person that's reading it. Because I don't know if you're more likely to have a person reading it that has read other things, so they know what the word should be. And you can use a different word in a different way, but you got to do that stylistically. Yeah. You can't just do it because you don't know that you're not supposed to use that tense or that conjugation of a word. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I tell people all the time, like, you have to know the rules so you can break them. Because if you're just breaking them because you don't know them, I'll say off-putting in a way, like, just like you said, you can tell generally when something's there and shouldn't be, as opposed to when something's there intentionally. And that's the difference between a good reading experience versus a faulty reading experience, because someone who knows the rules and breaks them intentionally versus doesn't know the rules so they don't realize they're doing something wrong or out of, I guess, I don't know how to say, out of context, maybe.
You like the rebel. You can't be a rebel if you're not rebelling against something that you understand you're rebelling against.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some things that you only get through context. I don't know if you've ever taken study in another language or speak another language, but one of the biggest things for language learners, one of the hardest things for language learners is just grammar. Right? If you're not raised with the language, especially English speakers, because like if you're learning a Romance language, Spanish, Italian, French, generally they put the modifier after. They put the modifier after the noun, where we generally put it before, right? We'll say beautiful girl, where they'll say like girl beautiful. Mm-hmm. And so if you're talking to somebody after learning a language, if you don't listen to the language actively, you don't pick up on those context clues. So you will continue kind of transferring your English into the other language. And so people will know that you are not a native speaker. And that's kind of how it transitions with reading and writing as well, where if you don't actively read, this is just to your point, right? If you're not actively reading, then you're not picking up on those context cues of saying, oh, this is how I'm supposed to write this thing, because this is what proper grammar is in constructing a written sentence as opposed to a spoken sentence, which they do have differences.
Yeah, it's what words they chose to learn. I guess that's a lot of where they learned it and what words were in that curriculum, or if they're self-taught, what words they chose to find a translation to. Like I was talking to a French guy once, and he wanted to say distant memory, but he said quiet souvenir. And in the context of what he was saying, I understood it. And I
Yeah,
was like, I
I
like
like
the
it.
way you said that. That's nice. And I get it. So there's a certain poetry, a happy poetry to it, but
I love that.
maybe all the time it's going to be a problem. And
All the time.
then
Yeah.
just trying to learn another language, whether you're learning a language app or on a language app or something else. My frustration is, even though, I've been studying Spanish for 2 years, I can't talk in a conversation
Mm.
because there's so many words that you maybe if you listed all the words you spoke in whatever language you learned, you could then learn those words in the other language. I think that would be better. And I would prefer to be able to know the words for things in another language and not worry so much about the order of the sentence, because I think they are going to be able to understand it. I'm not going to fit in with the native speakers though, because they're going to they will make fun of my Spanish as being like old English because I'm speaking that way. That seems like if a person came and talked to me in old English, I'd be like, what are you doing? So I'm talking to them in a weird version of Spanish, but
Overly
it's,
polite and overly without knowing
yeah.
that you're doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. So since I learned Spanish from Marines when I was at Camp Pendleton and then got deployed, my Spanish is not for polite conversation. It's
Yeah. I was gonna say the
it's
moment you said
different.
you learned it from Marines, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, you
It's
can't talk to like a 5-year-old.
it's not friendly. But I think I'd prefer to be 5-year old fluent in a language, sound like a 5-year old, but then still be able to communicate. It would be better than I am now,
Yeah.
because now, you're learning it for 2 years and then you're trying to order something in Spanish in a restaurant. And I'm not sure if they find that aggravating or not. They being the Spanish speaker
Yeah.
finds it aggravating because you don't have anybody to talk to with it. So it's difficult, but then I get there and when the moment comes to talk, I can't. Like I can ask for a Coke to go, but that's because I practice that. So I need to practice more of the words I normally use rather than just trying to grab them off the top of my head from things that some app or book taught me. These are the words you're supposed to use. And I think you can tell a Spanish speaker as Spanish as a second language that learned on something like Duolingo versus Rosetta Stone, because my experience is it's a different vocabulary. It's just different words they chose to talk about the same thing.
Is it? I haven't done both. I've done one, but then
Mm.
my Spanish speaking experience was I knew none of it. And then I went backpacking in South America for about 6 months. And that was kind of, well, if I don't learn now, I have no way to get around.
How'd that go? Did you learn it quicker then?
I definitely learned it quicker, or at least the necessities, and I was able to, ask for directions, ask for the bathroom, haggle in markets for prices, and learn numbers and things. So it was definitely a sink or swim, but you definitely learn. I would have learned
Mm.
faster if I wasn't palling around with another English speaker, because then I would have been forced to do it all the time, no matter what. But
Mm.
still, I left with no knowledge, or I went with no knowledge, and then came back with enough to have, again, that kind of what you were saying, that like 5-year-old fluency. I'll say maybe a 4-year-old fluency.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was in Costa Rica last month with my family, and I mean, Costa Rica is a very friendly space. You don't need to know Spanish necessarily if you're sticking to the kind of tourist areas, but we went really off grid to a place, and I was able to get us around. And I was in Cuba in 2016, and and that was far different if you didn't know Spanish. I don't know about today. I think more people, especially if you're sticking to tourist spots, speak English, but then not so much. And I was able to get us around, able to do the tours, able to kind of translate to a degree of what people are saying. So I'm not necessarily confident in my Spanish, but I can use it, especially when required.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I think the sentence structure doesn't matter so much, as long as it goes back to that creative writing advice of, is it is it understandable?
Yeah.
When we were in Ecuador, the guy goes, "You sound like you're Mexican," and I was like, "Well, that's a win. I'll
Yeah.
take that."
There you go. I sounded like I was Argentinian. And I was like, okay, I got
Oh,
it.
wow.
That was
Okay.
where I spent most of my time, or like Chile and Argentina, because well, my friend's Chilean, and she's gonna hate me if she hears this, but I think that the Chilean accent is the most difficult Spanish accent for me to understand,
Hmm.
and because I feel like they cut off half the words, but but they have a similar accent in terms of like they go je instead of yeah, so like a double L, they go je.
Yeah.
And I kind of picked up on that because I liked how it sounded when I was there. So I would just use that and just certain similar things that like the kind of the melody that I apparently speak with that I had no idea is very Argentinian. And so when I was in Costa Rica, they're like, "Where did you learn Spanish?" And I said I backpacked through all these places, but I spent most of my time here. I was like, yeah, sounds like it.
Huh.
Thank you.
Nice.
I don't know.
I don't know if I could pick out different Spanish accents. I could
Oh,
maybe tell the difference between Spain Spanish and Mexico Spanish, but it's when you say I in Spanish, this is way off topic. Do you say yo or Joe?
I say Joe.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like Joe better.
Yeah.
I like that. That sounds better to me. Like yo estudio español para dos años.
Right.
But it's then you talk to some people and they're like, "Are you saying J? Are you using a J?" I was like, no say.
I think I think it's one of my favorite things about learning languages. It's not that I'm fluent in any language, but I've taken traveling around and learning. I just pick up languages because you kind of have to at certain points, whether it's phrases or words. And when you learn words in whatever language the country speaks, people generally are a lot friendlier with you, even if the word has no context. For instance, I was in India and I started just picking up random words. And one of the phrases that I would say that got a lot of people smiling at me and really helping me out no matter what was I learned how to say crazy goat. I don't know why. I don't know why that was the phrase, but I would just say something about a crazy goat and everybody would laugh and be really friendly. And
Hmm.
I got a lot of help that way. And I just kind of continued on doing that little thing wherever I went. Like, all right, learn something silly, not rude or stupid, but silly.
Mm-hmm.
And it would endear me because I'm saying something silly in their language, not just me being like, I mean, I am silly, but it wasn't just like silly English guy. Now it's like, oh, silly, silly white guy. Come, you're harmless. Be friends.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're being nice and you're saying something that's comical, I think that gets you a lot farther
Yeah.
than being mean or presenting yourself as not approachable. So
Yeah.
if I had somebody that didn't speak English here and they said, "Can you help me find crazy goats?" then I'd be like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I'm going to help this person if I can." Versus, they're yelling at me something else. And like in French, one of the first things we learned was vache d'espace, space cow, because that's fun.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, yeah, I'd like to learn more languages, but it's difficult when you don't have places to use them.
Yeah.
At
There
least
are
that's my
probably
excuse for
tools.
not learning them.
No, I use that same excuse. There are tools though. I know that now there are, whether it's tutors online or there are some websites, and I wish I remember the name directly, but um, I have a book because I was really interested in learning languages. I have a book that's called Fluent Forever, and it's not about a specific language. It's just this opera singer who had to opera singers have to train for dialects. So they don't have to know Spanish and French and German and Italian, but they have to sound like they know how to speak it, right? You have to have the accent. So they
Mm,
train on that. Well, one opera singer, the guy who wrote the book, was really interested in actually learning the languages to help with his accents. And he knows like 10 languages now. He knows like Russian and German and French and Spanish and Romanian and whatever. So the book's just all about how he learned the languages, the ways that he taught himself. And in there, there's an index with all of the online tools that he used. And one of the websites was people who are matching up because they want to learn English and you want to learn Spanish or something. And so you do like a half hour of them speaking English to you and just having a conversation. And then you do the next half hour of doing Spanish. And so you can correct each other and you can practice and you can also hear how it sounds. It's, yeah.
That's a good idea. That's like The Last Samurai, where he enjoyed his conversation in English. It's good.
Good movie. Super good movie.
Well, where do you do most of your writing, to get back to the writing topic? Words, languages are words, and words is, spoken writing. So I guess we were still on topic, but
It was all on topic for me, especially because talking Spanish, my first book, or at least my first adult book, I got the idea when I was traveling in Buenos Aires, and I was talking with the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, and they
very
were
nice.
speaking Spanish. So I was like trying to learn and figure out, and I had some people helping, but it wasn't all, it wasn't all fluently direct from English, but it helps me understand. And so that language learning, it does come back for me for language and how to use the language and how to make sure I'm doing it justice and how to make sure I'm telling the stories appropriately, especially when they're not specifically my experience, which most writers, right? Most novels are not going to come directly from my experience or the travel or the writer's experience, but we have to get people to travel through these experiences in an authentic way. So in that book, I was not a 74-year-old Argentinian woman who lost a daughter to the dirty war in Argentina, but at the same time, I had to have you think that this person really went through this experience. And so the language, the pieces of language I pick up, the pieces of language I have to give to people, I think it's all fair and done. But to your original question, I prefer to write in a cafe, a Starbucks, a Barnes and Noble coffee shop, wherever it is. I like the white noise, and I like that it forces me to be focused on the thing that I'm there for, as opposed to at my office, which, don't get me wrong, I always work in my office. I have to work in my office. I have a 4-year-old, so I'm home a lot, and I have a day job of doing other things. But I like to remove myself from that feeling, right? And get away from that, because if I'm in my office, I feel like, oh, well, maybe I have to work on this other project for work, or, oh, did somebody just call me? Maybe I'll do my dishes instead of sitting here to write. So anywhere else, but mostly a cafe. I like to sit there. I like getting a hot drink of some kind, maybe a pastry because I'm a pastry fanatic, and
Nice.
giving myself that space.
Yeah, time and place. That's important. I think I find that for learning, like you go to school or you go to a class or you set your place up to get in that time and space. So
Yeah.
then writing, it makes sense with that. When you write, do you go in with a topic in mind, or like if you're working on a project, are you thinking, I'm trying to get to the end of this scene, or I'm just writing for this amount of time, or I'm writing for this word count? How do you set goals for yourself for writing then?
Mine's a time limit. I'm a 10-minute writer. And I learned this trick for myself during the pandemic, because during the pandemic, I had 4 or 5 writing jobs at a time. So by 8 o'clock at night, got to put the daughter to bed. She was, 2, 1.5, 2 then. Just like, put the daughter to bed. I still want to have time with my wife. I still need time to wind down. Do I have the mental capacity to write more for my novel? But I'm like, all right, 10 minutes. I can do 10 minutes. 10 minutes doesn't sound like a lot. So I'd set myself the timer. 10 minutes is not enough time to sit there and be afraid of the white page, right? So many people will sit there and be like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to write about. Maybe I'll have a prompt, right? Maybe I'll sit there and be like, all right, 2 people are in a restaurant, and and one of their dishes is wrong. What happens? And just to give myself something to start with. But normally 10 minutes, hit the page. I know that I'm going to be writing towards the overall project. So what can I do? Bam, let's go. And then 10-minute timers goes off. I'm done. I put it away. And when I feel like I have nothing more to write about or explore in that project, I compile all the pieces that I wrote, print it out, go through it, mark it up, be like, oh, this needs more of this. I'm currently doing that with my current project. I'm going through by hand, and I'm like, okay, I need to expand this scene. I need to put more character development in this scene. And so I already have, like, say 125, 145 pages, but now I know where I could blow it out. Now I know where the gaps are. Like, oh my goodness, I have them go here to here, but there's like whole thing that needs to happen in between here and here that I didn't even write yet. So now I know. And then I'll go through and I'll do, 10 minutes again until I cover all these notes that I took and print it out and go through all over again. So it's like, all right, do these changes work? Do these changes track? And again, me being a huge nerd, I go back to that idea of one of my favorite things is getting colored index cards, right? They even sell them in like 4 colors. I think it's pink, white, green, and blue or whatever. And I will go through and I'll take one color for one character, another color for another character, another color if they're both in the same scene at the same time. And I'll just do that and I'll write down one quick sentence. All right, what happens in this chapter? Right? That's the sentence. And then I'll put it all on my floor and then I'll start arranging things. We're like, all right, well, this scene needs to go here and this scene should go here. And this scene, based on this sentence, doesn't seem like it's doing enough. So do I need it or do I have to go back and flesh it out more to make it fit? And all these things. And I love doing that index card thing. I don't know why. I think it's like a big puzzle.
Yeah. I like that in timelines, make it easier to keep the story straight. Whether you're telling it in the linear fashion, at least you understand what's happening in this, and then you can set it against other things that are happening if within the story, or if you're writing one in a created world or the real world, what we call the real world, that you can see all the other things that are going on right now. So,
Yeah.
Or during that time.
Definitely.
Do you have I think you touched on it a little before, just off the first question, but do you have a theme that runs through everything, whether you're not writing on assignment, but maybe it could also be that a theme that kind of permeates all your writing that always seems to come back up, whether you realize it or not?
Well, I definitely realize if there are things that I don't realize, then I'd love to hear other people who've read all my stuff and be like, oh, this is definitely there. And if there's somebody out there who's read all my stuff who's not my mom or my dad, I welcome it. But when it's on assignment, my general focus tries to be something unique within it. When I say unique, my daily writing is travel writing for a company. And so I take most of my experiences, and if I haven't had this specific experience, I interview people who have had the experiences so I can give it as much authentic detail as possible. But I always try to find, if I'm doing like a listicle about the things to do in Rome, great. But I also want to have something in there that is more unique than what most lists you're going to find out there. Because of course, people know cooking classes, or people know go to the Vatican, and people know see the fountains and the museums. So it's like, what can I fit in here that people don't necessarily know they can do? And I always like to have that angle when I'm on assignment for my own work, for my creative stuff, for my novels, for my screenplays. Yeah, those obsessions with kind of the intergenerational trauma and how it affects people, the way that we create friendships and that friendships break down, I always find interesting, especially when friendships can seem so solid, but something really seemingly silly can all of a sudden demonstrate the fragility of the friendship. And it can break apart so quickly, even though it seemed like it was on solid footing. So then it's about how can you repair that? Is it repairable? And those are the things that I think often come up. So my most recent novel, Girl in the Ashes, is about a serial killer in World War II Paris. She's in occupied Paris. You follow the serial killer, so it's not like you're a detective trying to track her down. You are with her for the book. But it's still about, I did touch on this earlier, that morally gray area of her doing the wrong thing, but for the right reasons, or at least the reasons she uses to justify it. Can you get on board with it? Right? She's a serial killer, but can you feel, this was kind of in context with Dexter, the show, where Dexter says, yeah, I'm a serial killer, but I'm only killing bad guys. Can you connect with me over that? So how far can you push this character before the reader or the audience is going to say, nope, I cannot believe you did that. I'm no longer with you. I no longer trust you. And then how can you get the audience back on board? Right. So I really like to push those limits.
Yeah, I see that a lot in things where they you have the main character in a first show or the beginning of a book that they do something terrible, and you know that's there, so you go, oh, I don't like this person, but then that's the main character, and then you have to find a way to like them, whether it's The Sopranos or like House of Cards or something. You know, he kills the dog in one of the first, if not the first episode. Then now you're supposed to then care about what happens to him. So it's interesting to see that.
I find most people, at least maybe it's just in my orbit, but I find that most people are more willing to forgive somebody, forgive a character for killing someone than for killing an animal.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I basically would be like, all right, I can use you to kill this person, but I'll show you saving an animal. And maybe that'll get people on board. Save the cat.
I think that goes through on the deeper issue of that is it's the perceived fairness of it. Like
Yeah.
you're killing something that you'd be okay. You could kill it. It's not saying it's okay to kill. It's that it's possible for you to kill it. So why are you doing that? It's a powerless thing, or
Yeah.
it doesn't have the power that you have, and you're just wiping it out for the sake of evil. I mean, that's the definite. I think that's how you define the good and evil right up front, really easily, whether people recognize it or not. I think that's the objection for it. You have a person of using their power to destroy something that shouldn't be an issue for them. It's not a threat to them, something like that. But
No, I completely get
it's
on board
interesting.
with that. Yeah, absolutely. Like not that it's powerless, but at the same time, like how do you use the power that you have?
One of my big things I've been exploring is how you can have a character that's good, and if you're taking a good versus evil, just versus unjust, how much can you go? How long does it take for the good person to be seen as the bad person? Like, what can be done if that? Like, can good destroy evil? Like in the classic, good will defeat evil. How bad does good have to defeat evil before you say, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing? Ease up on that evil. Like, is
Yeah.
there a point where you're like that? So I think that's a strength for evil and a weakness for good, but I don't know, something to explore.
No, absolutely. I mean, the absolutist theory as well is so difficult where it's like at what point does the absolutist demonstrate that being an absolutist is a problem? I think The Peacemaker, if you ever watched, there was a show, but it was based on the character from one of the Suicides, I think the second Suicide Squad movie, or maybe the third one, where it shows you that in theory, this character, is patriotic and loves his country, and that's great. And he does all these good things. But then when pushed to a certain limit, it's like, all right, but at this point, it's starting to demonstrate how the absolute ideology of anything can be problematic because he's not willing to bend or break any rule as long as he fits into this really large macro idea of what can be considered this thing. And so it's like all of a sudden this good thing can bleed into this other area because there's no wiggle room.
What keeps you coming back to writing then? Like after you finish writing for one day and then you come back to it the next day, why do you come back to it?
It's just this there's just always more story to tell. Even with a story that's over, that's finished, there's another story there. I mean, I've taken to be like, okay, I wrote down these are all the story ideas for novels. These are all the novel ideas I have. There's 15 of them. So if I just did, that's at least 15 more years of novels if I did one a year, which usually doesn't work out that way. But then, of course, I'm like, oh, well, now I have this idea. All right, now there's 16. Oh, now I have this. Okay, there's 17. And because there's just so many more stories to explore. And writing is that form of expression that I have. It's the way that I can kind of cope with my own demons in a way. Like I joked about this with the last novel about a serial killer, right? I mean, better a serial killer on the page than a serial killer in life. even if I worry that someone's going to look at my web browsing history and be like, what are you into? It's like, it's research.
Yeah.
It's research.
Yeah.
But that just, keeps me coming back.
Nice. What's the best way for people to see your work and to follow your work?
I am active on LinkedIn. I'm active-ish on Instagram, and I'm active on Facebook. But within that space, the Instagram and Facebook space, generally, depending on how long I've been working on a project, I'll start reading one page from that project until I'm through. So I did it with my book Life Between Seconds. So that was 260 pages. So 260 days worth of reading is up there. And then I'm going to start doing that with Girl in the Ashes soon. And that's about 300 and some odd pages. So I'll be 300 and some odd pages worth of content and postings. You will just see me doing page by page.
Okay. And then do you have a website?
I do have a website. I usually say that first. So it's douglasweissman.com. And luckily, you can easily find my website, douglasweissman.com, or me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn at Douglas Weissman, because the only other person who shares my name on all these places is a dentist from New Jersey, I think. And I am definitely not a dentist from New Jersey. So my website as well, just kind of, there's a blog on there if you're interested in kind of writing tips, and there's just links to my books and things so you can explore, get in touch. I'm pretty open.
Nice. Well, in the show notes will be the links you talked about, your website, LinkedIn, and Instagram, so people can check those out if they didn't write them down. And is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't, or any thoughts you have in closing?
Well, I don't think I didn't talk about anything that I wanted to. You let me pretty much run a train on any thought that came into my mind. So I appreciate that. Well, when it comes to closing thoughts, I just really hope people are out there creating and getting in touch with that side of them, whether it's writing, or you mentioned kind of painting earlier on, just as a painter's perspective of just having that fingerprint on something, or whatever that creativity is. I think it's super important. And there was a quote that I heard recently, or that I remembered recently, I forget which, from Mr. Holland's Opus. I don't know if you saw that movie from the 90s.
Maybe.
Yeah. So it's the perspective of a musician who becomes a music teacher unwillingly, just because he needs a day job because he's a musician. But then 30 years of teaching, he loves it. But at the very end, his job gets cut because of budget cuts. And he says something to the board along the lines of, sooner or later, these kids are going to have nothing to read or write about. And that's what I feel about creativity. It's like, if you have all the time in the world, if you try to optimize all your time, what are you going to do with it? It's like, create something, whether that's a creative project in art, or whether it's like creating memories with family or whatever. Just create something good.
Nice. Sorry about the dog barking there. She's a big fan of Mr. Holland's Opus.
Apparently, yeah. As am I. Good for her.
Yeah. The guy from Close Encounters. Excellent. Well, all your links are in the show notes. Thank you very much for your time. I'll talk to you on the other side of this musical exit.